Today I'm going to be talking through the building of an olive ash coffee table. I bought this as one thick slab, and the sawmill I bought it from cut it in half so that the slabs were a book match. I start by cutting the slabs to the rough size. The pieces could be no larger than 320mm in width so that they'd fit through my planer. I don't have a jointer large enough to flatten one side, so I use a flat board, some shims and some glue, and then send the piece through the planer. Once one side is flat, the piece can be taken off the board and sent through the planer to flatten the other side. If you don't have a planer, you could use a router flattening jig. There's plenty of video tutorials on here, and I've done this in the past with larger tables. I then cut off the ends and establish my glue line. I probably should have taken more time with my glue line, but that'll become clear later on. I use dominoes here just to help with alignment in the glue up, but it's not really necessary. I've purposely glued up the tabletop larger than the final size to give me some wiggle room later on if needed. And it will be needed because I'm a ham. I'll be filling some of the voids with epoxy, and there's also a live edge in one of the corners of the table that I'd like to fill as well. I mark out the tabletop again, but not at full dimension, to trim off some of the excess. There is a void in the middle of the tabletop that I wanted to make a feature, so I just carve it very lightly with a Dremel to make the void look a little bit more natural. I then remove the bark from the voids. The epoxy won't properly stick to the wood if the bark's not removed, so this part's a pain in the arse, but really important. The underside of the table then needs to be taped up so that none of the epoxy leaks out of the voids. I also made a partial form with some scrap ply for the end of the table where the live edge is. With the epoxy I decided to go with a black pigment and mix the life and soul out of it. If I could give a helpful tip for epoxy, I'd say if you think you've mixed your epoxy fully, mix it for another 2 minutes just in case. Pouring the epoxy is pretty stressful, and I did have a few minor leaks, but these were fixed by just whacking a load more tape on the areas where it was leaking. Once the epoxy is poured, it needs to be left for 2 weeks until it's fully cured and can be worked on again. I'm not sure if it'll be clear in these shots, but here I made my first real error. There was a very slight gap in some of the sections of the glue line, and now the epoxy was showing through those gaps. These could have been easily covered up with glue and sawdust if I wasn't using epoxy on the tabletop. In the end, I just decided to cut the slab in two and re-glue it. This worked out well in one sense because I could flatten the tabletop through my planer to remove the excess epoxy. This definitely saved me a couple of hours of sanding, so silver linings and all that crack. I had to be pretty careful with the second glue up to make sure that the void in the middle lined up perfectly. With a couple of mil taken from the middle of the slab, I luckily still had room on both sides to cut the table to its final width. The finished dimensions of the table are 1200 by 600 mil. I sanded the tabletop from 80 through to 180 grit. A water pot between each grit, but I think you only really need to do this before the final grit. I put a 6mm round over on the top before the last pass at 180 grit. For the legs I used some leftover ash from a previous project. I decided I wanted a rail between the legs. I also wanted the legs to be at a very slight angle. I cut them on the table saw with a miter gauge at roughly 7.5 degrees, but it's not really important what angle was used, but just important that the cuts are all at the same angle. I used a stop block on the miter gauge to make sure that the 4 legs and 2 rails were the same size. I marked where the dominoes would go and decided to put 2 dominoes in each leg. I wasn't sure if just tape would be strong enough here, but I was happy with the results once it had been glued up. To connect the 2 legs together, I decided to make 2 centerpieces which could also be used to connect the legs to the tabletop. I marked out where I wanted the holes to be for the bolts and then put dominoes on the ends and also on the rails. The legs were sanded just like the tabletop from 80 to 180 grit. took the piece to the drill press and drilled 8 holes on each of the centre pieces. Then I could take the pieces to the tabletop, and I used double-sided tape to place them exactly where they needed to be located on the underside of the tabletop. I could drill through the existing holes in the centerpiece to mark the underside for the threaded inserts that will be installed later. The holes on the centerpiece were then drilled with a Forstner bit to allow for M8 bolts to fit through. An 8mm drill bit was then used on the underside. I used a Forstner bit and a pre-drill block here for the underside of the table, which had absolutely no benefit whatsoever, but I continued to use it for all 16 holes. I didn't have a regular 12mm bit for this part, but it would have been much easier, and I'll be getting one for future projects that need threaded inserts. I used a small amount of wood glue to secure the inserts. I've finished tables in the past with just wood screws, and I've never had any issues with wood movement, so I'm not fully sure if it's a necessary step, but I definitely think the bolts and threaded inserts make the table look like it was built by a semi-competent woodworker. Final steps for the construction of the legs was to glue the centre pieces to the rails. This is a pretty simple glue up, and I just used 2 sash clamps to glue them together. I decided to stain the legs black with Indian ink, as I thought this would make for a nice contrast with the tabletop and would match the epoxy. For the finish on the tabletop, I was pretty conflicted. I liked the lighter colour of the unfinished ash, so I opted to use Rubio cotton white. This is worked into the wood using a white pad and then buffed with a sander. The excess is wiped off the tabletop using a t-shirt from Penny's that had miraculously lost its shape in its first wash. I really liked the look of the wood with the white Rubio, but it really dulled the look of the epoxy, making it look slightly grey as opposed to black. After multiple big fat cups of tea and careful thought, I decided to sand the tabletop using a maroon pad and then applying a second coat of Rubio, but this time using the pure finish. In my opinion, this made the contrast of the epoxy and the ash look much better. I also put a coat of Rubio Pure over the Indian ink on the legs. As a little extra, I decided to make a set of coasters for the table. I had made a form and put in an offcut of ash so that any leftover epoxy from the table could be used for the coasters. I used a scrap piece of elm to make a small mitered box to hold the coasters. I used a laser engraver to brand the underside of the tabletop with my logo. the final step was to attach the legs to the tabletop with bolts. If you watched through this whole video and by some divine miracle actually enjoyed the video, I'd appreciate if you subscribe to my channel to stay tuned for future builds. With that, good luck and God bless.